place at the University of D.C. Law School.
All right, good evening, everybody. Assalamu alaikum. We want to welcome you all here to the University of District of Columbia David A. Clarke School of Law, and we thank you for coming out to this program that we've entitled The Black Messiah, the Life and Assassination of Malcolm X, otherwise known as Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz. We are here today to honor his memory, and Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz, Shahid, the martyr. Allah says in the Holy Quran, do not speak of those who have been slain in the way of Allah as dead. Nay, they are alive, though you perceive not. Martyrs in Islam occupy a very special place, as I'm sure they do in most cultures. These are people who have not only dedicated their lives to a righteous struggle, but have also sacrificed their lives in that same cause. And they deserve to be honored, and they deserve to be remembered properly. And they deserve to become an inspiration to those of us who are still here, who can follow along in their footsteps. 49 years ago today, Malik Shabazz became a martyr, and we're here today, this evening, in the short time that we have, to discuss his life and also the particular circumstances surrounding his assassination. Malik Shabazz, otherwise referred to in this program as the Black Messiah. We did not choose that title because it's pithy or creative. We chose that from the words of the Federal Bureau of Investigation as they put forth in a memo the goals of their counterintelligence program, otherwise known as COINTELPRO, which was an operation that took place and was conducted officially between 1956 and 1971. Unofficially, we would say that it never ended, and Shahid's going to talk a little bit more about that later on in the program. But they had 5 primary goals that were shown in their own documentation, and the story of how that documentation was acquired recently was put out in all of its glory in a book by Betty Metzger, who was a Washington Post writer, called The Burglary. And it discusses the story of these brave men and women who broke into an FBI field office and accidentally came across these documents and publicized them. And so the 4th point, the 4th goal, they said prevent militant that's the 3rd point. The 2nd point, prevent the rise of a Messiah who could unify, electrify, and electrify the militant black nationalist movement. Malcolm X might have been such a Messiah. This was 1968, which is why they were speaking of him in the past tense. Might have been such a Messiah. He is the martyr of the movement today. Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael, and Elijah Muhammad all aspire to this position. Elijah Muhammad is less of a threat because of his age. King could be a very real contender for this position should he abandon his supposed obedience to white liberal doctrines of nonviolence and embrace black nationalism. Carmichael has the necessary charisma to be a real threat in this way. So the way in which the FBI and other agencies, the CIA, was tracking Malcolm, particularly in the last years of his life when he had become more of an international figure. The New York Police Department had a special unit, I believe it was the Bureau of Special Services, or the BOSS unit, that was tracking Malcolm. And as was part of their counterintelligence tactics, not only with Malcolm, not only with other groups such as the Nation of Islam, such as King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Congress on Racial Equality, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Revolutionary Action Movement, which comprise the primary targets of the so-called black nationalist hate groups, which is what they term them, but also the communist organizations, the New Left, anti-war and peace organizations, and on and on. But one of their tactics was to foment dissension within those organizations and within those movements, to create animosity if it wasn't there, to stoke animosity if it was there, and to otherwise manipulate people into doing their dirty work for them. In the case of Malcolm, even there were informants and other people who had infiltrators into his organizations, and I believe the person pretending to give him mouth-to-mouth resuscitation after he had been shot multiple times by several gunmen was in fact an FBI agent, Gene Roberts, who was also his bodyguard. So we're going to be going more into that. And so this was their way, and the way in which they were able to do this with Malcolm became an example, a trailblazing mission which they began to use on other leaders and other organizations, including King, including the schism in the Black Panther Party between what some people refer to as the Huey Newton faction and the Eldridge Cleaver faction. Some people don't like those designations, but you can maybe use them for blanket purposes. But there's a lot of nuances to many of these things because there were a lot of different people and personalities involved, and sometimes it's not fair to use such generalizations. So pardon me to anyone who's watching or who will watch. There's another way to look at this assassination on Malik Shabazz, and I look at it also as a theft, as a grand larceny, because he was stolen from us. He was stolen from the black community, he was stolen from the Muslim community, he was stolen from the Brotherhood of Man. And following that, in the years and decades intervening, his memory has also been stolen and smudged and undermined and otherwise changed. Historians refer to this as revisionist history, and thankfully we have Dr. Jared Ball, who's also on the panel, and he's going to be discussing that. But this is another tactic that we see not only with Malcolm but with others, also notably Dr. Martin Luther King. When we talk about Malcolm, we get this 1963 version of Malcolm very often. We don't get the 1965 version, which is better described as Malik Shabazz. We still, even among ourselves, we still often refer to him as Malcolm X, but he no longer went by that name in the last years of his life. He was Malik Shabazz. And what we get is this often in pop culture, through our history texts in grade school and in the public schools, this 1963 Nation of Islam, Malcolm X. But he had gone beyond that. After he had been forced out of the nation, after he had gone on Hajj and had the opportunity to see human beings of all different colors and all different ethnic backgrounds gathered together in Mecca on the pilgrimage that Muslims are required to make, and seeing them cooperating, this human family, all cooperating, getting along in a unified purpose, that inspired him. And he said, what, this is what America needs. America needs this Islam, or America could at least learn from what the Muslims are doing. So he attempted to bring that back, and he established the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, which was a way to bring those who were in the Nation of Islam into a more orthodox learning and teaching of Islam, and also to bring people who weren't Muslims, to give them an opportunity to learn about what true Islam was. And in addition to doing that, he also developed the Organization of Afro-American Unity, which was a variation of the Organization of African Unity, which was an organization that existed on the African continent, whereas the different countries could work together on issues of mutual concern. And therefore, the OAAU was developed here so African Americans could from Detroit, from Chicago, from New York, and so on and so forth, could also work together on issues of mutual concern. During the latter years of his life, he had become an international figure. You know, he had gone beyond the street corners of Harlem and Washington, D.C., and Los Angeles, and he was now going to Asia, to Africa, to the Caribbean, and had become an international force propagating and internationalizing the African-American struggle. And this became a very real concern to the powers that be. Even if you take, for example, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, this was pushed in large part by folks going into the South and being hosed down and protesting, and these images being plastered across TV screens all around the world, and America's dirty laundry being aired out in public. You know, America has sought incessantly to promote itself as an exemplar of moral authority and human rights in the world. And you know, many of us would agree that they are certainly not. You know, many of us may disagree, but I would say that they are not. And during this period, there was also, of course, the Cold War, and one of the fronts of which the Cold War was fought was in the United Nations regarding human rights, whereas the United States wanted to push their agenda, which had to do with, you know, civil rights and things of that nature, and the Soviet Union wanted to push a more rights-based model of economic rights and social rights and things of that nature. And so Malcolm Malik Shabazz inserting himself in this struggle and saying, you know what, we're going to go to the United Nations. We are going to put the African-American struggle in front of the United Nations. We are going to force the United States to be held accountable in front of their international peers for what they have done to us, for what they continue to be doing. This was a problem for those who did not want that to happen. And so when we look at our brother, you know, these are the things that we also remember. You know, the last 2 years of his life were very forceful and very pivotal, and we want to, you know, certainly remind folks of that. Although he had become a target before he even became Muslim, while he was still in prison, because of some contact he had had with some communist groups, and by the time of 49 years ago today, the FBI had compiled I think 23,000 pages of documents over the course of those 10 years or so. Finally, I just want to say that we recognize that again, we can't bring our brother back from the ether, but we can certainly salvage and reconstruct his memory and set the record straight and dispel any lingering misconceptions about what his life was about and how his assassination was executed. With us today we have John Judge, who is the executive director of the Museum of Hidden History, which was instrumental in putting this program together, along with the help of several student organizations, several of which I'm a part, the UDC chapter of the National Lawyers Guild, also the Black Law Students Association, and the Black Men's Law Society, who is represented in the back by Brother Gino Ray, and I think Randall. I can't see, there's a pillar in my face, but I know y'all are back there. And also with the help of Mr. Lewis Perry and Joe Libertelli and Dean Canty, who is our Dean of Admissions, who actually brought us all here. We have a lot to be thankful for in this room. But John Judge contacted me, and we were able to work together on this. He's an independent researcher, lecturer, and author of the book Judge for Yourself. He was the co-founder of both the Committee for an Open Archives and the Coalition on Political Assassinations. He has studied all the major political assassinations of the last century and helped to draft both the JFK Assassination Records Act and the Martin Luther King Jr. Records Act, currently in Congress. Judge also co-founded the 9/11 Research Project, the Mujahid Intelligence Library, and is working to create a museum of hidden history in Washington, D.C. You can go to the website www.politicalassasinations.com and also www.museumofhiddenhistory.org. We've also been joined by Dr. Baba Zach Kondo, who is married and the father of 7 children. For the past 8 years, he has been a professor of history at Baltimore City Community College. Prior to this, he spent 15 years teaching history and black studies at Bowie State University in Maryland, where he also founded and coordinated Pan-African Studies. He has also taught at Goddard College in Vermont, Gettysburg College in Pennsylvania, and Thomas Edison State College in New Jersey. He is the author of Conspiracies, Unraveling the Assassination of Malcolm X, and numerous other works, including The Black Student's Guide and A Crash Course in Black History. Also, Shahid Buttar, who's in between Dr. Zach Kondo and John Judge, who is the Executive Director of the Bill of Rights Defense Committee and its work defending civil liberties and constitutional rights. Shahid received his Juris Doctorate from Stanford Law School in 2003, where he served as Executive Editor of the Stanford Environmental Law Journal and was a teaching assistant for constitutional law. In addition to his work as a civil rights lawyer, community organizer, and independent columnist, Shahid is also an independent columnist and hip-hop and electronica artist. Dr. Jared Ball got his degrees at the University of Maryland College Park, in a PhD in media studies from Cornell University, also a master's of public service or political science in African studies in Frostburg State University, as well as a bachelor's in history. His professional career included work as an associate professor of communication studies and assistant professor of communication studies at Morgan State University, a lecturer in black studies at University of Maryland College Park, and a lecturer in media studies at Frostburg State University between 2004 and 2011. He is currently an associate professor of communication studies at Morgan State University in Baltimore. His research interests include the interaction between colonialism, mass media, theory and history, as well as the development of underground journalism and cultural expressions as mechanisms of social movements and political organization. Ball is the co-editor of the recently published book, A Lie of Reinvention, Correcting Manning Marable's Malcolm X. He can be found online at imixwhatilike.org. That book was a response to the recently published book by Manning Marable, A Life of Reinvention. Many in the academic and activist community were appalled at some of the assertions that were made in that book, and the book that was compiled by Dr. Jared Ball answers that. Finally, Mr. John Potash is the author of the book, The FBI War on Tupac Shakur and Black Leaders. U.S. intelligence's murderous targeting of Tupac, MLK, Malcolm, the Panthers, Jimi Hendrix, Bob Marley, rappers, and linked ethnic leftists. He attended graduate school at Columbia University, where he started a national award-winning newspaper, Social Justice Action Quarterly. He first published an article with the theme of this book in Claustrophobia's spring 1995 issue. He then published a larger piece in Covert Action Quarterly, a magazine started by CIA whistleblower Phil Agee. And finally, my name is Naji Mujahid, also known as William Fenwick. I'm a law student here at the University of District of Columbia. And prior to law school, I was and still am a journalist focused on social justice issues, particularly those related to police, prisons, and state repression. Also a member of the Jericho movement. I have been deeply involved in advocacy on behalf of political prisoners in the United States since 2006, at which time I also co-founded the Black August Planning Organization, which is an organization geared toward providing a historical overview of the ongoing movement for black liberation and ensuring that political prisoners are not forgotten. Thank you again for all of you coming out, and we are going to begin the panel starting with Mr. John Judge.
Thanks, Naji.
You want to sit down?
Yeah, I'll get up here.
Okay.
Sorry. Thanks. Thanks for the introduction, Naji, and thank you to the UDC Law School for hosting the event, and thank you for C-SPAN 3 American History Channel for coming out to record it. And I understand it's going to be broadcast on that channel sometime in the future. Part of the problem that we have in addressing these issues is that we don't know the entirety of our own history. Our history has been in large part stolen from us, some by miseducation and wrong assumptions, some by paradigms that keep people within a particular framework of thought because they don't know or hear counter-narratives about history, and some because it has been actively hidden from us and buried over many decades by the national security state. So even when you talk about an event like this one that happened 49 years ago today, the assassination of a major leader in the African American community, we face the problem that not all the records have been released about that period of history. They still remain classified and hidden. There has been, of course, much good independent scholarship and research on this issue and other historical issues. There has been some success using the Freedom of Information Act, but it's been limited, and so many records still remain closed. Our organization, the Coalition of Political Assassinations, was formed to help implement the JFK Records Act that we were behind, and that's been one of the most successful record releases. Over 6.5 million pages were released, but still not everything. And similar records are being held in the hundreds of thousands of pages about the life and death of Dr. Martin Luther King, which is why when I worked on the Hill for Representative Cynthia McKinney, we drafted a Martin Luther King Records Act, but we're working hard to get someone to sponsor it in Congress to get those records loose, and there are still records buried about Malcolm X and other leaders and political activists that have been killed. And this is because, as I say, we don't really own our own history. And when a people don't own their history, they are essentially a conquered people, because they cannot plug into who they are, where they came from, or what the context they live in the current day. A lot of the basis, I think, of the ability to carry out these kinds of assassinations and operations rests in a surveillance capability that earlier began in the early 1900s. Army intelligence, G2, was headed up by a Colonel Vandeman, and he began collecting records shortly after the Russian Revolution on all sorts of activists in the United States. And his lists led to the Palmer raids and massive deportations of people, as well as imprisonment of labor leaders, radicals, anarchists, and others. His files, which were quite extensive on at least hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people at that point, were handed over to J. Edgar Hoover at the beginning of his attempt to create the Federal Bureau of Investigation. In addition to that, military intelligence spied on people right up through the 1960s. It's not talked about as much as the CIA spying and the FBI spying, but what we're talking about today in the news is really military intelligence spying. The NSA is under the Defense Intelligence Agency. And the grandfather of Dr. Martin Luther King was spied upon by the government. And they identified people as threats to internal security all through this period. And they then began to plan responses to them, which included, at particular periods, rounding up whole segments of the population that they felt were a threat and putting them into pre-designated internment camps, much in the same way that Native Americans were pushed into reservations earlier, designated military bases, and even some of the old camps that they set up for the internment of Japanese Americans at the time of World War II. The McCarran Act, the 1950s, no longer current, talks about arresting anyone who might possibly be thinking of probably committing any act of espionage or sabotage or any plan to overthrow the government of the United States. These people could be picked up without writ of habeas corpus under the Act and put into indefinite detention for the duration of the crisis. I think those terms probably ring, if you're reading the news now, to how people are treated in this enemy combatant category. But there's a long history of this kind of thinking, and then there was a rise, certainly at the end of World War II, to both a permanent warfare economy and a national security state. What President Eisenhower warned about in his final talk, leaving office, and in his first draft, a military industrial intelligence complex was the first draft. And that complex is what much of current day activity, but going back even those 45, 50 years, determines where we are. Independent agencies were created, like the CIA, the FBI. They had no effective oversight by Congress, and they are out of control in the same way that the NSA is. FBI began to collect additional dossiers until Hoover bragged in the 1960s that that there were 250 million people living in America, and that he had dossiers on 200 million of them, and he wanted to close the gap. There were then, in that period, political assassinations that were really the purpose of the assassinations, in my view, including Malcolm, was to kill hope. Hope for social change, hope for social organizing, hope for a progressive move in the country. And our last panel we had last year at Howard University, Michael Druba Moore spoke, and he said that political assassinations serve the purpose of changing the conversation, the context of the conversation, and the social issues that are happening. Dr. King and Malcolm were spied on by the COINTELPRO program that's been mentioned, the FBI, and also a program called RIBAT, which was an anti-communist program. The CIA had its own operation called Chaos that was targeting black militant organizations. And the Army intelligence had Lantern Spike, which was an anti-riot and surveillance group, and Garden Plot, which was a martial law plan aimed at destroying not only African-American activists, but also peace activists and people working against the war and other militants that were rising in that period, all of whom were seen as enemies of the state. And at one point, the Congress discovered that the DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, and the Army Intelligence had records on over 8 million Americans. They then ordered them destroyed, and I actually tracked for several years all the different times that those destroyed documents reappeared at a different military base. And I found at least 8 different times, so I guess they have one more life left if they're like a cat, but these documents were destroyed and then rediscovered. And I'm sure they still exist and feed into the overall surveillance. Naji mentioned this book, The Burglary, by Betty Metzger, just out, and very important, about these independent citizen activists. I don't want to call them whistleblowers, they were like sort of whistle stealers, but they decided to break into an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania, and they took all the files because they didn't know what was important and what wasn't, but in the course of going through them, they discovered what she calls J. Edgar Hoover's secret FBI and the COINTELPRO programs and the targeting of individuals and groups in order to destroy them one way or the other. And that was the first public expose of what activists, I'm sure, saw as attacks on them but couldn't identify as a solid program. We're told that the COINTELPRO ended, but I think that exists quite actively under other names, and some of the speakers will make clear that the people they went after in the 1960s, it's their children that are now being targeted as well. And that figures into the Malcolm X case in my view as well. In addition to that, there were operations with all this surveillance and all this supposed threat. There were plans drawn up for martial law, like Garden Plot, for rounding up the entire black population. I mentioned to Jared at one point that Jared Ball, that the director of FEMA, Louis Goffrida, Federal Emergency Management Agency, got his thesis at the War College approved, and it was a thesis on how to round up all black Americans in the United States, you know, and how to encircle them and take them into camps and move them. And this was his working thesis, and Jared asked me if I thought he could get one approved if they had one to round up all the white people in the United States. You know, how far that would go. But this was an actual thing that he did, and then he became, you know, director of FEMA, and they had these martial law plans. Each year, Rex 84 was a plan to round up Central American activists and their supporters in the United States. And there was a link then made between the National Security Council, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and the DOD. And it was those three agencies that came into control when they announced continuity of government after 9/11. And there were additional plans exposed during the Watergate. There was the Tom Houston Plan. I suggest people go back and look at the Tom Houston Plan. It's up at the Federation of American Scientists site. It was a plan for martial law, but it is a blueprint and outline for much of what we live under today in the post-9/11 period. In Contragate, there was exposed another martial law plan Oliver North was involved with. They went into closed session, and they came out saying there was no such plan. Much of this got exposed at some point by the Church Committee, Senate Church Committee, but money from the illegal drug operations that the intelligence agencies were involved in went into elections, and almost everybody on the Church Committee was unelected by the next round and taken out of office for even saying anything about it. But Senator Church did expose both CIA, FBI, and other agencies for a lot of criminal activity and overstretching their bounds. And it infuriated Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, who then began alternate planning in the Reagan years for the continuity of government. But you know, and the first thing after 9/11, I remember this on the news in D.C., they blamed the Church Committee. They said that the Church Committee had tied the hands of the FBI and the CIA, and so they weren't able to catch the terrorists. But I mean, it goes a great deal deeper than that. But you know, that was as close as we got to any effective oversight or review. If the country ever goes to Code Red, they impose continuity of government, and they did say after 9/11 that we were in continuity of government, and a month later the FBI, the Washington Post had a headline that said shadow government operating in secret, and so they were operating out of undisclosed locations and from these bunkers. But if they ever do go to Code Red, about 150 federal legal authorities change, and the military takes over, among other things, all highways, all communication, all media, and a very small segment of people are then chosen to run the government without interference from the Congress or the population. And they do exercises on all this involving National Guard and other people right to the current day. In the instant case that we're talking about tonight, there was infiltration from almost its inception of the Nation of Islam by federal agents and FBI, and part of that infiltration took the form of creating rivalries in those organizations, because the point of COINTELPRO, which was really invented by William Sullivan and Cartha Deek DeLoach, who were naval intelligence operatives who came into the FBI at the end of World War II and set up the Domestic Operation Division there, and were instrumental in several of these assassinations. But the infiltration there included trying to destroy the organization by creating rivalries, and those rivalries led to leadership that replaced Malcolm X, like Louis Farrakhan, calling for his death and talking about how a nation should treat a traitor. There was active surveillance of Malcolm by FBI, CIA, and military intelligence. There was penetration of Malcolm's security, the Organization of African Unity, by BOSSI, the Bureau of Special Services and Investigations in New York, which was a police red squad and covert operation group. There was a pattern in the King assassination and other assassinations, including Malcolm, of removal of police security prior to the event, and then the capture and incarceration of false suspects. One of the three actual shooters was captured, Thomas Hayer, but contended I think recently paroled, but contended all the time that the other two people that were arrested were not his associates. And that's similar to the framing of people like James Earl Ray, who did not shoot Dr. Martin Luther King, the framing of Sirhan Sirhan, who did not shoot Robert Kennedy, and similarly Lee Harvey Oswald in the Kennedy case. One identified shooter is still living free, William Bradley in Newark. He denies it. Roland Shepard spoke at our last conference. He was on the scene. He was asked by one of the security guards for Malcolm to move from his usual seat up front. The three gunmen came and sat down in the seat shortly after that. He saw them do the shooting. He was taken into a police station later for questioning. He saw a man come out of the bathroom who had been the man who shot Malcolm with the shotgun. And he came out of the bathroom in the police department, went over and sat down at one of the desks. And he later, when I sent him a photo of this individual in New Jersey, he at least said that that's the person that he saw. But Zach and Kondo can talk further about that. I wanted to mention quickly the grandson and the daughter of Malcolm. One of Malcolm, to show how twisted this is, one of Malcolm's daughters was drug addicted. The FBI knew it. They sent a white drug dealer in to provide drugs to her and start a relationship with her. And he encouraged her to kill Louis Farrakhan because of this view that Louis Farrakhan had been involved in the killing of her father. So this is a generation later, they're taking the other side and having them kill the people that they set up in the first place. And I'm very suspicious of the death of Malcolm's grandson in Mexico City. I don't know how much you followed it. But COINTELPRO was renewed after 9/11. They militarized the police after the Vietnam period. Every agency has a SWAT team. And it goes right up to the current time, and I suggest this article in the new Intercept online journal it's Glenn Greenwald and Jeremy Scahill, the NSA's secret role in the U.S. assassination program. And these are actual programs where they link the drone attacks to the information that the NSA is drawing up. And assassination has become legal. And so it's linking the two. But we exist in a time of accelerated militarization and of the same agencies that created these problems being totally uncontrolled and surveilling us and threatening us. And I think that being aware of it is the first thing, but secondly, I think we need a strategy to deal with it.
Next we'll have Baba Zach Kondo, and you're going to come up? Okay. Just so you know, there are these note cards floating around. We're going to collect them towards the end of the program, and we'll do our Q&A that way. So if you have a question, please make a note of it and write it down, and we'll collect it from you later.
How much time?
15. How many? 15.
Okay, there's a traditional African practice that I subscribe to in which a younger person asks an older person for permission to speak. So I'm going to ask my sister Vivian Canty for permission to speak, and all you need to say is yes or no. Yes, thank you very much. It is indeed an honor and a pleasure to be here. 15 minutes isn't a whole lot of time to basically talk about Malcolm's assassination, but, I will, give it a good shot. What I like to do normally is to reconstruct the assassination of Malcolm X inside this room. So I think I'm gonna do that. And then what I want to do is I want to talk about my book. I published a book 21 years ago called Conspiracies Unraveling the Assassination of Malcolm X. And that was basically accumulation of 11 years of studying Malcolm's assassination. And what I was interested in doing was trying to resolve it, try to figure out exactly who, in fact, was responsible for Malcolm's assassination. And what I basically uncovered during my 11 years in interviewing lots of people, going through every FBI file that had been released at the time that I was doing it, CIA files, boss files, any files that I could basically get my hands on, interviewing people. And what I basically found was that Malcolm's assassination was the result of 3 intertwined conspiracies. Now, I know in the United States, conspiracy is a bad word. You know, as a historian, you know, through the, who's, went through the system, this system wants you to think that conspiracies do not exist unless you're in some damn communist country or something like that. Conspiracies historically is as American as apple pie and baseball. So what I basically found was there were 3 intertwined conspiracies in the assassination of Malcolm X. One was orchestrated by the Federal Bureau of Investigation under the leadership of J. Edgar Hoover. The second was orchestrated by the leadership, the national leadership of the Nation of Islam, specifically Elijah Muhammad and what was generally known as the royal family, that is the leadership class of the Nation of Islam, most of whom were Elijah Muhammad's family. And then the third one was the NYPD, but specifically BALSI, the Bureau of Special Services and Investigation. John mentioned them a few minutes ago. BALSI was pretty much a miniature FBI. And they basically did the same things that the bigger FBI did as far as counterintelligence was concerned, as far as surveillance was concerned, as far as illegal activities designed to neutralize people. So what I basically found was that Malcolm's assassination was the result of these 3 forces coming together and basically having a common enemy and ultimately killing Malcolm X. Now, let me set it up in this room. The day is February 21st, 1965. The time is approximately 3:08 p.m. It's a Sunday. It's cold outside. We're in New York City in the Audubon Ballroom near St. Nicholas and Broadway. Malcolm X is backstage. He is, waiting to speak. Benjamin Goodman is here speaking. When he finishes, he's going to introduce Malcolm to you, to the audience. Malcolm is telling an aide backstage that something is wrong, that he should not be here, that he wasn't feeling right. He was apparently sensing that there was some negative energy inside this room, and indeed, there was some negative energy inside this room. 5 Negroes, all of them members of Mosque number 25 Newark, were inside this room, waiting their chance to kill Malcolm X. 2 of them were sitting here on the corner. One's name was I've been doing this for so long, it still bothers me to know that we know the names of the people, and of these people that we're going to talk about, only one of them actually did time for Malcolm's assassination. It's amazing. One of the men sitting there, he has a .38 German Luger. His name is Leon Davis. He's about 20 years old. Person sitting next to him is Talmadge Hare. He's 22 years old. He has a .45. About 4 rows behind them, there's a man by the name of Bradley, Willie Bradley. He's about 28 years old. He's packing a J.C. Higgins 12-gauge double-barreled, sawed-off shotgun. A few rows behind him is a man by the name, we always thought his name was Wilbur McKinley because that's the name that Hare later released, but come to find out his name appears to have been John Kinney. He's sitting there, and then behind him is a man by the name of Benjamin Thomas. Now, Benjamin Thomas is the Assistant Secretary of Mosque number 25. He's the person who actually organized this particular team. However, Benjamin Goodman is still speaking. Malcolm is still backstage. And so the killers basically wait. Malcolm is now getting up. He leaves the altar room and he walks to the stage. Benjamin Goodman sees him and begins to wrap up his speech. He introduces Malcolm to the audience. It's about 400 of you. He calls Malcolm a shining prince. He talks about how Malcolm was willing to give his life for you. Malcolm walks toward the stage, the altar. They pass each other. Malcolm walks to the stage, and soon after, the man sitting behind the shotgun of Willa Bradley, he causes a commotion. He says he accuses someone of picking his pocket. At this stage of the game, McKinley, what he basically did was he had a sock, and he had matches in it, and he lit the sock, and it, and then he throws it, and it makes this sound. So some people thought it was a bomb, and people are looking, trying to figure out what's going on. Malcolm walks away from the stage a few feet and tells people basically to hold it, hold it. In fact, he says it several times. At that stage of the game, Willie Bradley with the J.C. Higgins sawed-off shotgun stands up. He handles it like an expert, according to the witnesses. He shoots it from a crouch position, empties both barrels into Malcolm's chest, blowing a 7-inch hole. At this stage of the game, of course, pandemonium begins to break out. At this stage of the game, Davis and Hare stand up with the .45, with the .38 Luger, and basically empty their bullets into Malcolm's prone body. Of course, by then, it really doesn't matter. Now, by now, pandemonium, everything's chaos is going on. The assassins basically start heading for the doors after that. And after all is said and done, only one of them will be captured at the scene, and that will be Talmadge Hare. Ultimately, he's going to be charged with Malcolm's assassination. Now, for the next few weeks, the NYPD tells the press that they were looking for 5 people. And in fact, they were in fact looking for 5 people because there were 5 people in that, in that murder team. However, after March 3rd, when they arrested the 3rd person, a man by the name of Thomas Johnson, then they closed their investigation. So basically, they were just telling the whole world that the other 2 can pretty much, go on about their business, that they were not looking for them. The Malcolm X trial, the police investigation of the trial, all of it was basically a travesty. And behind the scenes, it was the Federal Bureau of Investigation basically manipulating it almost every step of the way. Now, let me change gears real quick. I want to talk about the Nation of Islam. Most of you in here know that Malcolm, was a member of the Nation of Islam for 12 years. He was one of the major forces that made the Nation of Islam, a viable, important organization. He had energy. And in fact, in many ways, there was a perfect marriage for almost 12 years between Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad. Malcolm X needed Elijah Muhammad's paternalism, his wisdom, his experience, his guidance. On the other hand, Malcolm needed Elijah Muhammad's, On the other hand, Elijah Muhammad needed Malcolm's youth, diligence, perseverance, his confidence. Together, these 2 men forged an extraordinary union, a powerful union. But tragically, between the FBI and the royal family, this union is basically going to come tumbling down. Let me say something first about the royal family. I'm going to make this very quick. If you want to study Malcolm's assassination, you have to look at the family of Elijah Muhammad. For different reasons, most of it was personal. They had issues with Malcolm. In some ways, Malcolm was the son, or one of the sons that Elijah Muhammad never had. And so he gave Malcolm special privileges, special status, within the organization, but even within his personal space as well. And so what ultimately ends up happening is there's a lot of jealousy brewing between the royal family and Malcolm X. And the FBI, who has been studying the Nation of Islam, for the last, couple decades, and have been studying Malcolm since he was in prison in 1950, they started looking at and realizing that there was tension between Malcolm and the royal family. And so this is going to be the angle that the Bureau will basically use to go after Malcolm, the royal family. So the way that they ultimately end up doing is they have a disruption plan. And let me be real clear. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had all types of counterintelligence programs. They didn't always call their counterintelligence programs. Sometimes they just simply called it a disruption program. And this is what they basically had within, for the Nation of Islam. It was a disruption plan. So one of the things that I was able to do, through the documents, was basically to just outline step by step how the Bureau basically was able to take two men who loved each other, who would have given their lives for each other, and basically turn them against each other using all types of counterintelligence programs, all types of activities, all types of schemes. They would do badjacketing. Badjacketing was when they would basically put out the Bureau, through its informants within the Nation of Islam, would basically put out a negative rumor about somebody. And this is what they would do, which was actually quite scientific. They're listening to Malcolm's phone. They're listening to Elijah Muhammad's phone. They're listening to the family. And so what happens is when they hear a conversation in which the family, for example, might be saying something about Malcolm, and they hear Elijah Muhammad reacting to it in a negative way, then they take notes and say, we could probably develop a scheme around that because obviously Elijah Muhammad reacted negatively. Let's exploit that. And they're going to, throughout 1963 throughout 1963, they're going to constantly be doing just that. And ultimately what's going to happen is, because there was, in fact, some weaknesses in the relationship, by 1963, there were weaknesses in the relationship between Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X, and the FBI is basically going to exploit it to the maximum. Once they did that, then they're going to go to the next level, and that is once Malcolm was suspended, then the goal was to get Malcolm kicked out of the nation. Once Malcolm was kicked out of the nation, then the goal was to basically create a war between Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam. And it's going to be this war that ultimately will result in the assassination of Malcolm X. So I was told I had about 5 minutes. Is my 5 minutes up? About 3 more minutes? Yeah. So for the most part, that's kind of like a summary. Now, a couple other things real quickly in my 3 minutes. The trial that took place a year after the assassination, as I said earlier, it was a travesty. Now, the bottom line was this. The 5 men that walked into the Audubon on February 21st, 1965 and basically destroyed Malcolm X, all but one of them got away. So what the Bureau helps the NYPD do and the District Attorney of New York do is to basically frame 2 innocent men who ultimately both will spend 20 years plus for Malcolm's assassination. Neither one of them will actually be at the Audubon Ballroom at the time of Malcolm's assassination. I found a document in which the Bureau, and I want you to understand this real quickly. The Bureau knows that Butler and Johnson had nothing to do with Malcolm's assassination. How do I know this? Because I found a document in which the Bureau basically tells you that, according to their sources, neither Johnson nor Butler was nowhere near the Audubon Ballroom. And yet, at the same time, this was the same Bureau that was constantly feeding it the NYPD and the District Attorney information that basically implicated Butler and Johnson. So these were the types of travesties that basically took place in the assassination of Malcolm X. So I'm going to basically end it there. And during the question and answer period, if we can get more, if you want to get more detailed, I would certainly be happy to do that. Thank you very much.
We kept going back and forth about whether to use this or not, but I guess we'll use it.
Oh,
if it's okay.
We did? Oh, did you prefer to use the LCD screen?
Nah, well, we'll just see how it works. I mean, what do you think, John? You want to go for it?
I think you just move these chairs out of the way.
I just might need help turn this thing on. Let's see if it's good. Does anyone know how to get this thing going, the projector part? Somebody here did before, and now I think they're gone. Let me see if... I'm trying to see what I'm saying. Okay, here we go. On. There's 3. Okay. Is that coming on?
Yeah, it's on. It says warming up.
Okay. All right. Okay. Sorry, guys.
Yeah, there's an image of Malcolm.
Yeah, okay. Good. Thanks. All right, guys. Okay. Guys, my name is John Potash, and for the sake of legitimacy, I'll just tell you that my book, The FBI War on Tupac Shakur and Black Leaders, had a contribution of a foreword to the foreword by Mumia Abu-Jamal, and Fred Hampton Jr. contributed an afterword. And my talk is going to discuss Malcolm X and the Shakurs, but I just wanted to mention, since the legacy was mentioned by John Judge, Fred Hampton Jr. Wrote an article detailing how an undercover agent sabotaged his legacy tour with Malcolm Shabazz. They were touring the country. I was supposed to do a presentation with him in Baltimore, and when Fred Hampton Jr. came to Baltimore, he said Malcolm Shabazz has not been showing up at the last half dozen meetings, and he thinks an undercover agent, his Minister of Information, has been sabotaging their tour, and he found out that was the truth. He kicked that Minister of Information out, and then Shabazz ended up dead within a year in Mexico. He was murdered in Mexico. Now, my book contains over 1,000 endnotes documenting its sources, what I'm going to present to you tonight. Okay, that's just a picture of Fred Hampton Jr. and Malcolm, and Mumia Abu-Jamal with Pan Africa. And this is a document from the Department of Justice. And, sorry, I'm getting a... Is that working out? Thanks, Naji. This is a document from the Department of Justice confirming that I paid them the right amount of money for 4,000 pages to be copied. Of course, they only sent me 99 pages and said for national security reasons they're withholding the rest of the pages. So I'm going to mostly, I'm going to spend about a third of my talk on Malcolm X, a third of my talk on the Shakur legacy that came from Malcolm X's group, and a third of my talk on Tupac Shakur. And I'm going to try to cut out some of the stuff that overlaps with some of the other speakers. Now, as we talked about before, the name of this conference was The Black Messiah. It was based on an FBI document. Here is the excerpt from that FBI document. This is an actual copy of the FBI document. Here's, this is the magnified excerpt of it. The only reason we have this FBI document is because of those media activists that stole it from a media office, an FBI office in 1971. Now, first thing I'll say is that, guys, the National Security Act of 1947 made the CIA the supervisors of all other intelligence. And the CIA was started by the top wealthiest families in this country that owned the multinational corporations. People like Francis Stoner Saunders, a British editor, documented how they put their own family members in the leadership and their own associates, like Dulles, who was a lawyer for the Rockefellers, for example, as the heads of the CIA in the beginning. So when Malcolm X went to Africa and threatened deals that these multinational corporations were making with these African leaders, which I argue were going to swindle the African leaders of their wealth and resources and swindle their people of using their wealth and resources, that's when the multinational corporations said, we got to stop this. Malcolm X was pointing out the racism amongst these multinational corporate leaders and to the African leaders that didn't know, about this, how bad racism was in the U.S. And they only allowed Malcolm X in their leadership meetings in the group called the Organization of African Unity that Naji mentioned before. Because of that, the CIA, of course, wanted him dead. And now my talk overlaps some of what Professor Zach Kondo said, and I appreciate his research. My research overlaps that. I just put more emphasis on U.S. intelligence and their role in assassinating Malcolm X. The way my research shows that the CIA actually overlaps with agents in the FBI, and then the FBI overlaps with agents in police intelligence. And I give names of some of these people that have both the titles of FBI agent and police intelligence agent in New York, but also in Los Angeles, and in police intelligence agents all over the country. Now, Malcolm criticized America's capitalist system as leading what occupiers now call the 1% to exploit the 99% in general, but he further believed that America's historical racism kept people of color particularly disadvantaged. With the CIA representing that 1% of the wealthiest, Malcolm X believed that they set up a near-fatal poisoning of him in Cairo, Egypt, late July of 1964. They didn't want him to present a planned United Nations appeal to African leaders that the U.S. was violating blacks' human rights. Malcolm had been concerned about the Nation of Islam's recent death threats after splitting with them, but he knew that they didn't have a global spy capacity. By 1965, Malcolm had organized the Organization of African American Unity. FBI undercover agent John X. Ali had become part of Malcolm X's life. He first lived with Malcolm X in 1958 and gave police intelligence the floor plans to their house. And when police intelligence came in, they shot up Malcolm X's office immediately. But Malcolm X survived that attack. In 1965, John X. Ali was believed to have led the firebombing of Malcolm X's house. Now, several FBI undercover agents and the Nation of Islam national staff helped Ali rise within the Nation of Islam. And this was attested to by Wallace Muhammad, Elijah Muhammad's son. Elijah Muhammad was, of course, the head of the Nation of Islam. And it was also attested to by FBI documents. Now, furthermore, an FBI document attests that John X. Ali met with Talmadge Hayer, who was also referred to as Thomas Hagen in some documents, but he was one of the three gunmen that killed Malcolm X, assassinated Malcolm X. Much more evidence supports the other aspects of how U.S. intelligence assassinated Malcolm X. One key piece of evidence would later involve the targeting of the Shakurs. By 1965, undercover New York police intelligence agent Eugene Roberts had risen amongst Malcolm X's security team. That New York police intelligence unit was an extension of FBI's counterintelligence program, or COINTELPRO, which people refer to here as Bureau of Special Services Investigation, or BOSSI. I argue that it wasn't that unique because, well, for one thing, they put a CIA agent as heading BOSSI. Okay, so that shows the overlap between CIA, FBI, and police intelligence. But Los Angeles police had a huge counterintelligence program also in its local police intelligence, and most cities did have a version of that. On February 21st, 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated by gunmen in Harlem's Audubon Ballroom. At the Audubon, where Malcolm X gave his last speech, uniformed police left the area despite usually filling inside and outside the halls during Malcolm's speeches. Security guard undercover agent Eugene Roberts was there with a woman named Joan Roberts, sitting next to Malcolm's wife, Betty Shabazz, and some of their kids. Betty Shabazz is seen here. When the gunmen started shooting Malcolm X, Betty Shabazz grabbed her kids and pushed their heads down. When the shooting stopped, Betty Shabazz, a nurse, went to run over to Malcolm. Joan Roberts grabbed Shabazz to stop her. Shabazz threw Roberts into the wall and ran over to her husband. Eugene Roberts was already there and told Betty Shabazz that Malcolm was dead. Now, the importance of Eugene Roberts' role as the first to arrive at Malcolm X's bullet-ridden body and check his life signs is underscored by Martin Luther King's assassination. Martin Luther King's friend, William Pepper, seen here with King, later represented the King family in an underreported 1999 trial that found the government guilty of collaborating in Martin Luther King's assassination. Pepper said that Merrill McCullough was a military intelligence agent who had infiltrated MLK's group, was the first to arrive at King's bullet-ridden body to check King's life signs, and then signaled the backup government snipers that the assassination was successful and they could disengage. McCullough received a promotion to the CIA just after MLK's assassination. Now, regarding the Shakur family, Salyuddin Abba Shakur had joined Malcolm X's Organization of American unity and become part of Malcolm X's inner circle. Just before Malcolm X was assassinated, Abba Shakur's sons joined Malcolm's group. This included Abba's biological sons, Lumumba, seen here, and Zaid Shakur, as well as his adopted son, Mutulu. Sorry about that. Seen here. After Malcolm X's assassination, Abba Shakur joined the Revolutionary Action Movement in New York. His son, Mutulu Shakur, went with him before co-founding the Republic of New Africa, a national group that first convened in Detroit. Inspired by Malcolm X, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale had founded the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense in Oakland, California in late 1966. Undercover U.S. intelligence agent Eugene Roberts followed Lumumba Shakur as he founded the Harlem Black Panther Party in 1968. Zaid Shakur co-founded the Bronx Black Panthers as their Minister of Information. Tupac Shakur's mother, Afeni Shakur, seen here, joined the Harlem Panther chapter and married Lumumba. Undercover agent Eugene Roberts helped police frame and indict 21 of the New York Panther leaders, including Lumumba and Afeni Shakur, in 1969. The Panther 21 decided to have Afeni first released on bail as their spokesperson, and she was elected the Harlem Panther leader at that time. She got pregnant with Tupac while out on bail, and Lumumba divorced her soon after. Afeni defended herself in court, helping get all of the Panther 21 found not guilty. Meanwhile, Zaid Shakur tried to mend what the FBI manufactured as the East Coast versus West Coast Black Panther War. I'll get more into why that sounds so familiar. The FBI used undercover agents and fake letters to help create that war. When Panthers started getting murdered around the country for no apparent reason, Zaid went underground, where he was soon joined by his and Afeni's close Panther comrade, Joanne Chesmar, seen here. Chesmar then changed her name to Assata Shakur out of respect for Zaid and Afeni Shakur. Zaid helped co-found the Black Liberation Army. Afeni moved in with Zaid and Lumumba's adopted brother, Mutulu Shakur, in the early 1970s. At that time, the FBI started a propaganda campaign against Assata Shakur, putting her on the FBI's most wanted list and making her a shoot-to-kill target by police. In May of 1973, New Jersey police pulled over Zaid and Assata Shakur's car. Police fatally shot Zaid while wounding Assata and the former Panther 21 member Sundiata Akali. Now, I'm being told I don't have a lot of time left, so I'm going to fast forward a little bit. Mutulu Shakur then was charged with helping spring Assata out of jail, okay, and he did that with Weather Underground members and other people, other activists around the country. Mutulu Shakur was later, I argue, he was convicted of conspiring to rob an armed bank truck. They had no physical evidence to put him in jail, but he's in jail. He's still in jail after decades. Now, following that, Afeni Shakur brought up Tupac, and Tupac ended up growing up with top radical mentors. He joined a group called the New African People's Organization, which was started by former Black Panthers and Republic of New African Party leaders. Here's Tupac on the lap of Mutulu Shakur before he went into jail. This is Watani Tayahimba, one of Tupac's mentors. He was a co-founding member of the New African People's Organization, later became his business manager. This is Tupac with a fellow member of the New African Panthers wearing a Panther shirt when Tupac's a teenager. Now, by the time Tupac was 17 years old, he was elected head of the New African Panthers, a young adult group in the New African People's Organization that was active in 8 cities nationwide. So he was already a national Panther leader before he became a rapper, and thus he was a target. And this New African Panthers was the same age as the Black Panthers when they first started nationwide. Now, Nikki Giovanni, a celebrated poet, had recently said in her tour this year that she thinks Tupac Shakur was assassinated in line with the Kennedys and MLK and Malcolm X. You can see the title here in the magazine. She said it on national radio. And I'm going to tell you some of the evidence why. When Tupac first came out with his album, Tupacalypse Now, he made his record debut. Police stopped him in Oakland, apparently supposedly for jaywalking. They hit his head against the curb and choked him unconscious, and I showed 2 other incidents where victims died in police custody that way. Some of the other attacks, now, as Tupac gained more wealth and fame, the attacks on him by police became more sophisticated. This is Tupac and Juice. Tupac then started a movement called the Thug Life Movement. That was a plan to pretend to be a gangster in order to appeal to gangs and politicize them. His business manager and political mentor, Watani Tayihimba, confirmed that to me. So that's not who he really was. Okay, that was just a facade. And the reason he was doing that to politicize gang members is because his extended Panther family was doing that nationwide. They were getting the Bloods and Crips in California to call peace truces and start turning into activists, and that was spreading nationwide to the point that in New York, the Latin Kings, the top gang in New York, turned into activists and were targeted accordingly. Okay. This is a code of thug life. He was trying to have gangs lessen the damage they did to their own neighborhoods before they turned into activists. This is Huey Newton. Huey Newton was assassinated in 1989. Exactly 3 years later, Tupac received his second major murderous attack. In front of police, strangers shot at him for no reason, and police only arrested Tupac and not the people that shot at him at the Marin Fest. This is Tupac's stepbrother. This is Richard Held, who was supervising the San Francisco Bay Area where that second attack occurred, that both assassinated Huey Newton, the co-founder of the Black Panther Party, and then led at least 3 murderous attacks on Tupac. This is Judy Barry. Held tried to set a bomb off in her car. He was accused of it and then retired early because they went very far in court. This is just a kind of paragraph from a book that describes how in Atlanta, purportedly off-duty police officers smashed Tupac's car window and shot at him. Tupac rolled out the back, grabbed a guard's gun, and shot back, but was let off in court because witnesses said the police shot first. These police said they got, the gun that they were using, that they shot Tupac with, was actually stolen out of an evidence locker. That's called a throwaway gun that they use when they, falsely murder someone and want to just get rid of it, get rid of the evidence. I'm just going to fast forward a little bit. Tupac was again shot and instead of being shot at, he was actually shot several times in the New York recording studio lobby. This is him being escorted away from that shooting scene. Kathy Scott, crime reporter, award-winning crime reporter, said that she talked to the security guard who said the whole incident was caught on videotape, and he offered the videotape to police, and they turned it down and closed the case. The person who set up that shooting was an associate of a man named Haitian Jacques Aignant. Haitian Jacques Aignant set up a sexual assault scene where Tupac was accused of forced sodomy and attempting forced sodomy, assisting forced sodomy. He got found not guilty of all charges except touching this woman's butt against her will. They agreed that they had consensual sex 3 days before and that the oral sex was consensual, but he got 1.5 to 4.5 years in prison for touching her butt against her will after consensual sex. Aignant was charged and pleaded guilty to the same exact offense and got a misdemeanor. And Aignant is referred to in Tupac's lyrics as Haitian Jack, knew he was working for the Fed, set me up, wet me up, meaning shot me. And because an associate had set him up in that New York recording studio lobby shooting. This is just a doctor's affidavit that you got Tupac had 2 bullets go through his skull, one side of his skull and out the other, and he miraculously survived that New York shooting. It was a murder attempt and not a attempted burglary, as the police said. I'm going to fast forward to that's Tupac's New York trial lawyer. This is just how when Tupac went in prison for about a year, they put him in solitary confinement and messed his mind up with solitary confinement for 23 to 24 hours a day. He had no human contact. Then this is about the murder of Biggie Smalls, but this is Fannie Shakur and Huey Newton. They set them against each other in the East Coast versus West Coast Panther War. They use the same tactics I show for the East Coast versus West Coast Rap War to set Tupac against Biggie Smalls, his friend. Okay. And then they shot people and killed people the same way they did Panthers and pretended like it was camp, people associated with each camp from the East Coast and West Coast. This is Detective Russell Poole, a high-level white police detective who found that his fellow Los Angeles police officers killed Biggie Smalls in order to hide their actual murder of Tupac Shakur. So his investigation, an official investigation, concluded that his fellow police officers were at all levels of death row records, dozens of them he found, and that they had killed Tupac Shakur and then they killed Biggie Smalls to hide what they did to Tupac. So I show more evidence than just that Death Row Records was actually a U.S. intelligence front company. They were also trafficking drugs and guns and trying to end the Bloods versus Crips peace truce. Okay, now this is just a page from the book that comes from Detective Poole's documents, saying when he talked to his superiors, what are all my fellow cops doing in death row? They said, well, you can call them covert agents. And I've got a copy of that in my book. Now, this is Dr. Dre. They did the same thing with Dr. Dre in terms of trying to set him up to start turning negative. Okay, I've got to close it up, guys. And I'll just say at the end, this is Agent Hackey, who was a security guard for Tupac, who was also employed by the FBI. He turned on the FBI and told Tupac not to go to Las Vegas the night he was shot. But Tupac had to go for another reason. He ended up going and was killed. Of course, Hackey was fired before Vegas happened because he told Tupac not to go to Vegas. And he says he's got documents to prove that the FBI was in the motorcade when Tupac was assassinated. And lastly, I'll just say U.S. intelligence had started, in the Miami Herald revealed that U.S. intelligence has RAP units. The main RAP units were in L.A. and New York, and they trained RAP units all over the country to do the same activities that they were doing, the corruption and the targeting of political rappers and political activists and political musicians all around the country. Okay, guys, and my purpose for this book and the DVD, of course, is to stop this and to change it and to protect the leaders we still have. So I hope you join me in that. Okay? Thanks a lot.
Yeah, if you don't mind.
Thank you all. We have two remaining speakers, Dr. Jared Ball. We're going to go back into the life of Brother Malcolm and try to put it back together, based on, again, as we mentioned earlier, the revisionist history that has taken place in the intervening decades. And we're going to conclude with Shahid Buttar, where we're going to bring a lot of what we've discussed today into its present-day machinations and what we see in the U.S. intelligence agency currently, what Shahid has referred to as COINTELPRO 2.0.
All right, thank you, everybody. Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. All right, good. Thank you very much. I intend in the few moments I have to quickly make the following points. Malcolm X was a revolutionary, not an immature and slowly evolving radical turned liberal Democrat. Kwame Ture was right that, quote, black visibility is not black power. But to deny that fact, constant attempts are necessary to assail the unassailable, symbol of Malcolm X, to justify the fraudulent leadership that has emerged in his absence as their own self-defense mechanism, protecting against successive generations actually maintaining the political standards Malcolm himself set, standards that had become the international standard of black struggle, and standards that would drive each and every one of his fraudulent heirs into obscurity where parenthetically they belong. Thirdly, such attempts to distort Malcolm as he was remain necessary because despite immaterial symbolic adjustments, the material conditions and lived experiences of black people in this country and elsewhere continue to devolve. Again, black visibility is not black power. I agree with those who see this too as a most dangerous moment, where despite those devolving conditions, the kinds of response, the political analysis and organization so ever present and central in the life and work of Malcolm X is largely absent today, making us less likely than ever to develop the kind of radical response Malcolm X said was necessary to upend a radically bad situation. As Dr. Alma Baini, editor of Pambazuka News, reminds us in her piece published today, quote, Malcolm X was a revolutionary Pan-Africanist and an internationalist, end quote. I will add that he was also an anti-imperialist, an anti-capitalist, and was, until the end of his life, fully engaged in developing organizations that took seriously his most famous phrase, organizations that were moving towards liberating us by any means necessary. Malcolm X could not be reconciled with the world as it was or with the methods and pace freedom movements were taking in his lifetime. What happened? Oh.
Push the Is that button?
Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
Do I need to start over? Again, Malcolm X could not be reconciled with the world as it was or with the methods and pace of freedom movements were taking in his lifetime. He was a threat to the state and to the soft established leadership of what was supposed to be an internal opposition. This, broadly speaking, led to his death, and as was perfectly summarized by John Judge and Baba Zach Kondo and John Potash here, there's not much more that I need to add to that or that could be added in this quick moment. Reconciling Malcolm X with this state, with its imperialism abroad or its undemocratic polyarchy at home, could only even become a thought after his death. So simply put, what we collectively tried to do in a lie of reinvention, correcting Manning Marable's Malcolm X, was to offer a counterbalance, an attempt to negate the negation, that is the kinds of scholarship and pop cultural or pundit-driven media spectacle that works so hard to diminish the radical brilliance of Malcolm X and the ideas with which he grappled. None of the current established civil rights leadership, black popular media punditry, and certainly not the political class atop which Barack Obama is quite literally resting, have anything to do with the actual lived politics, efforts at organization, or analysis of Malcolm X, other than to serve as an eraser of sorts, a cleansing of space in order to make it inhabitable for themselves. They represent an attempt to negate Malcolm X and the ideas that produced him, and to forcibly reconcile a revolutionary with an absence of revolution, in fact, a devolution, a devolving set of conditions faced by the very communities with whom Malcolm X sought most to struggle. Barack Obama represents the antithesis of Malcolm X and the movement from which he emerged. It is that movement that remains so threatening in its nationalism, Pan-Africanism, socialism, and anti-imperialism that is now targeted with cyclical preemptive strikes. In this case, in the soft liberal forms Malcolm is forced to assume when reinvented by those now claiming him minus the man himself. The now late Amiri Baraka said this would happen to Malcolm, something that by the way is now happening to him, when he said that, quote, "There is, of course, the syndrome Lenin spoke about when he said that once opponents of the bourgeoisie are dead, the rulers transform these class enemies into ciphers of agreeable sycophants of imperialism, however askew they might have seemed in life, who are now rehabilitated all the way to being represented as the very opposite ideologically of what they actually were in life," end quote. So we still see emerging scholarship that seeks to diminish or caricature the politics of Malcolm X. We see popular media recitations, when any at all exist, that parrot the simplistic and truly ignorant pattern of his life, claiming a kind of maturing political evolution from angry nationalist to post-Meckham integrationalist and liberal Democrat civil rights worker, ultimately killed by the violence and anger in which he only previously engaged. But again, similar to the now late Amiri Baraka, who was often too simplistically reduced to the label pattern of beat black nationalist communist, he said of those labels himself, quote, the truth is that in going toward and away from some name, some identifiable headline of one's life, the steps are names too, but we ain't that precise yet," end quote. And we still ain't that precise with Malcolm. So recently, my comrade Rosa Clemente had to do what she could to make her own mini media spectacle around the misuse of Malcolm's image by Nicki Minaj. A valiant effort indeed to take on such a heavily promoted artist and her misguided use of symbol. Are you all familiar with what I'm talking about? Yeah. Yeah, right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. But this is precisely the kind of work predicted as necessary by the FBI's counterintelligence program, which said in its fifth tenet aimed at black America that black youth must be discouraged from the kinds of politics best represented by Malcolm X. So it stands to reason that in 2014, as black material conditions and those of most of the world worsen, the image of Malcolm X that is too big to omit has to be returned to us in a form that is devoid of its original context or meaning. In Minaj's hands, Malcolm's image is reduced to supporting her braggadocio, where she in verse after verse just looks to demean those who aren't materially as well off as she. What better way for capitalism to co-opt this its class enemy and submit that symbol to the mercy of a sycophant of imperialism. We cannot forget that Minaj is a product of one of the 3 largest music companies in the world, itself a subsidiary of an even larger conglomerate. She is produced for and promoted to us in precisely a manner consistent with a counterintelligence program desire to assure that no further generations of black people actually assume the political identity of Malcolm X as he was. And symbolically leading this moment is the marketing community's recognized 2008 brand of the year, President Barack Obama. Symbolically standing as a testament of the denial of the worsening inequality in the world, attacks on labor, increased and expanded warfare, surveillance and establishment of control over Africa's militaries. But again, Malcolm actually was, and as Dr. Biney again reminds us, testifies against this imposed symbolic shift. As Biney tells us, Malcolm X saw our interaction with the world as having an entirely different purpose, saying that what we too need to be saying again now, quote, that the purpose of our meeting tonight is to show the relationship between the struggle that is going on the African continent and the struggle that's going on among Afro-Americans here in this country. I, for one, would like to impress, especially upon those who call themselves leaders, the importance of realizing the direct connection between the struggle of the Afro-American in this country and the struggle of our people all over the world. As long as we think that we should get Mississippi straightened out before we worry about the Congo, you'll never get Mississippi straightened out. Not until you start realizing your connection with the Congo. We have to realize what part of our struggle has in the overall world struggle. Secondly, we need allies. And as long as you and I think we are only getting allies from the Bronx or allies, from up on the Grand Concourse, where you don't live, as long as you and I think that the only source or area from which we can get allies, our source of allies, is limited. But when we realize how large this earth is and how many different people there are on it and how closely they resemble us, then we turn to them for a sort of help or aid or to form alliances, then we'll make a little faster progress, end quote. Finally, the former political prisoner Dhoruba bin Wahad once said, if Malcolm X was alive today, he would be a political prisoner. He would not be the subject of books written by the academic and institutional elite. He would not have been the subject of Spike Lee's worst film. Malcolm would not be claimed by so many as a hero as he is today. He would be in prison with the very people who continue to suffer the consequences of actually adhering to the ideas and principles Malcolm X best exemplified. So while some continue to attempt to reconcile Malcolm X with Barack Obama and the kind of establishment, Wall Street, militarist politics that have lofted him to 2 terms in office, the lie is confirmed by the very actions taken by the Obama administration, including its announcement carried out by a black FBI agent and under the auspices of a black attorney general, assigning Assata Shakur as the first woman ever to be on the FBI's most wanted terrorist list. Shakur, along with people like Marshall Eddie Conway, Russell Maroon Shoatz, Mumia Abu-Jamal, Sundiata Acoli, Jalil Muntaqim, Mutulu Shakur, Leonard Peltier, Kevin Rashid Johnson, David Gilbert, Tom Manning, and no disrespect to Chelsea and her supporters, but she isn't even the only Manning held as a political prisoner, nor the only white one. And many more, all represent Malcolm X's actual politics and all represent in their conditions the true relationship those ideas have with this state. Malcolm X was assassinated because he represented a militant and uncompromising set of ideas that demand self-determination, freedom from Western imperialism and capitalism, redistributive economics, and a refusal to accept symbolic reform and the absence of genuine material improvement in this life, in this world, and on this day. We still must demand that kind of liberation and still must seek to organize a movement that will impose a new world on this one by any means necessary. So in the words of another true political heir of Malcolm X, one too treated as such by the state, as Fred Hampton once used to say, to you I say peace, if you're willing to fight for it. Thank you all very much.
All right, thank you. As we welcome our next speaker, Shahid Buttar, I want to, those of you who had questions and you have a note card, you can begin passing those down, and we'll collect them in a few moments. And if they're directed towards a panelist in particular, please note that on the card. Thank you.
Thanks, Naji. And can people hear me okay? I want to first just thank all the co-sponsoring organizations, each of you for being here, UDC. I'll take a moment just to note that there are plenty of women who can also speak about these issues in the movement for equal rights for women. I think it's okay, John, thanks. That the movement for equal rights for women was among the many movements that was particularly impacted by the FBI's COINTELPRO programs in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. So I'm going to talk a little bit about history. I'm going to talk a little bit about corruption. I'm going to talk particularly about freedom of thought and how it relates to the NSA's dragnet that you might have heard about over the last year. And I'm going to try to leave you with some action opportunities and things that you can do about this. John mentioned at the close of his remarks the need for a strategy. It is that in which I'm particularly interested in, specifically engaging you in it. So let's just start with secrecy and corruption. So one of the themes you heard about here tonight pervading the political assassinations of the 1970s is this pattern of obfuscation. And I want to connect that to the particular controversy surrounding the NSA, the National Security Agency, and the domestic surveillance programs that you've been hearing about over the last year, prompted by the revelations by whistleblower Edward Snowden and the Congressional Reform Track, the President's Review Board, the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, multiple federal judges are all reviewing these programs, and as well as a dozen state legislatures, which I'll come back to in about 10 minutes. When those programs were started in 2002, they were flatly illegal. There is no serious contention that they were legal when they started. So these were illegal secret programs in clear violation of the federal statute, passed not long after this era we've been discussing, after the Watergate era, after the COINTELPRO exposure and the Church Committee hearings. Congress took several steps to try to put the genie of domestic surveillance in a bottle. They included a set of Attorney General's guidelines, first promulgated in 1976 by then Attorney General Edward Levy. They included the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA. FISA was written to constrain the CIA and the FBI from conducting domestic intelligence, particularly because of its historical politicization that we've been talking about this evening. It was rewritten in 2008 with then Senator Barack Obama's eventual support to essentially permit most of what the NSA has been caught doing in the last year. The point I want to make here is that at no point has there ever been a reasoned, open, transparent debate about these programs. Not when they were created, at no point over the 10 years that they've been operating, and not in the years since they became central to the American consciousness. We still don't know not only this history about the assassinations of the last era, we don't know what's happening now under our feet. Congress has been legislating in the dark, reauthorizing the Patriot Act 4 times since President Obama took office alone, and it's so bad in terms of the revelation of the reality beyond the secrecy is that the authors of the Patriot Act themselves have introduced a bill to essentially curtail its worst abuses. And when the authors of the Patriot Act and Edward Snowden and the entire civil liberties community line up to the liberal left of, follow me here, the head of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Dianne Feinstein, the Senate Intelligence Committee is the successor to the Church Committee. President Barack Obama, the nation's first black president, Attorney General Eric Holder, the nation's first black Attorney General, all of these actors who you would expect some degree of independence from all stand to the authoritarian right of the authors of the Patriot Act. Think about that for a second. This might disturb you. Some of you might remember Attorney General John Ashcroft. From a civil rights perspective, he's the best Attorney General we've had since. And I don't mean that as a joke. That should terrify you. We'll get into a little bit more about this in a second. All right. So beyond secrecy and active obfuscation, I want to just focus on one particular contrast between the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, and Edward Snowden. So Edward Snowden is a person who never swore an oath to defend any constitution, yet he resigned a very lucrative career to expose official lies to the American public. There are unsupported allegations that he had some sort of personal interest in this. There's been a lot of smears by the intelligence agencies against Edward Snowden, not unlike those you might have heard about Fred Hampton or Malcolm X or any of the other figures we're talking about this evening. So locate the contemporary context in a recurring pattern that you've seen before. The actors and the names change, but the roles are well established. And in the face of Edward Snowden's supposed criminality, in what is essentially the most quintessentially patriotic act you could fathom, is the Director of National Intelligence, who continues to hold a seat in the administration, has been caught red-handed lying to Congress and admitting it, and I would submit to you that there's no higher crime in our republic than essentially embezzling public resources and then lying to the people who write the checks about what you're doing with it. That's what the Director of National Intelligence and the entire NSA leadership has done. This does rise to the level of what we would describe accurately in any other country as corruption. And there's no reason we should hesitate to use the word. We're not just talking about an assault on privacy. We're also, and I'll get to freedom of thought in a second, we are also talking about outright corruption pervading the national security establishment, in which, unfortunately, the present administration has become complicit. Rest with that for a second. I want to talk briefly about freedom of thought. So people think about the impact on privacy of pervasive surveillance. And just to contextualize how bad is the surveillance that the NSA is conducting, for people born since 2002, everything they have ever said, heard, read, or written that was not in person or in a physical book has been archived and monitored, archived by the United States government. Everything they have ever heard or read or said or written. That's an incredibly disturbing prospect when you think about how that compendium of data could be used if politicized. Why might we fear its potential politicization? Because government intelligence has always been politicized, as you can see from my colleague's remarks, right? We're not doing this from a neutral baseline. The tools that the intelligence agencies had available to them in the COINTELPRO era are dwarfed by those available today. Never in human history has a society been more monitored by its government than we today in the United States, with the possible exception of contemporary China. In East Germany, the Soviet Union had nothing on the CIA and the NSA and the FBI and CBP and the local police departments and the NCTC and the alphabet soup, the litany of duplicative, wasteful, I dare say fraudulent, corrupt government institutions that are engaged in the enterprise of monitoring you in the exercise of your supposedly free speech. So let's talk a little bit about COINTELPRO after the Church Committee. In the 1980s, CISPAS, the coalition in solidarity with the people of El Salvador, this was mostly faith-based U.S. network supporting Latin American human rights, was its infiltration by the FBI in the 1980s has been well documented. In the 1990s, the radical environmental movement, the animal rights movement, were viciously not only infiltrated. There was a reference, I believe in John's remarks, to Judy Berry, who was an environmental activist who was bombed by the FBI that then tried to blame it on her before being ordered to pay $4.3 million in damages by a federal judge. And that was in the 90s, well before 9/11. The next time somebody tries to tell you a narrative that the crackdown on civil liberty started after the 9/11 attacks, don't buy it. It started well before that, and one of the first targets in your lifetimes was the environmental movement. And we can say, for instance, what were the impacts on the rights of black Americans by the attacks on the black nationalist movement and the movement for black power? Right? You can see downstream impacts in the settings of those movements. The same is true with respect to the environmental movement. Right? Climate change is at the center of the public discussion now. It was being forced onto the public agenda 20 years ago by a set of people who are now either in jail or on the international lam. How different would our public policy be if speech were actually free instead of criminalized? Since 9/11, certainly Muslims have been in the crosshairs. Peace and justice activists not far from here in Maryland, state police were caught spying on activists who were on both sides of the death penalty, both sides of reproductive rights. And the point I want to draw out here is that government surveillance is an equal opportunity abuse. You don't necessarily have to have a particular political perspective. You just have to have a political perspective. If you have any political perspective that is outside the dominant institutions, you are a target for government surveillance, disruption, and what the FBI called in its campaign to neutralize, I just gave it away, neutralization. That was the word that the FBI used when targeting civil rights and other leaders. All right, so I want to fast forward. After 9/11, we talked about the origins of the NSA's program. I want to jump ahead to 2008, which was a critical year for a few reasons. So, first, the Bush administration is stepping out of office. The Obama administration is coming in. There was a question at the time about which way would Washington break. Barack Obama campaigned for the White House, largely on a platform of restoring what he described as a balance between liberty and security, which were not opposed principles, reversing the Bush legacy, only then, unfortunately, to entrench it. I'm going to tell you a quick story from July 2008, which I find very illustrative in the context of the current debate surrounding NSA spying. So 2008, the FISA. Remember 5 minutes ago we were talking about the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act passed in the 1970s by Congress to stop domestic spying. In 2008, proposed amendments to FISA are introduced to essentially permit everything that the original statute was passed to prohibit. Then Senator Barack Obama pledges to filibuster the law, not only to oppose the proposed amendments, but also to filibuster them, right, to go to the mat opposing them, only to ultimately sign them. In July 2008, the largest affinity group on mybarackobama.com was a group that called itself Get FISA Right, which the president did not. And in July 2008, 4 months before the presidential election, he wrote a letter to the group, Get FISA Right, on his site, saying that the reason I signed this law was so that I could curtail these programs as a president, which, of course, he's not done. To his credit, a few weeks ago, he did announce what I would describe as a meager, under-inclusive, and within itself not particularly objectionable, but in a broader context, counterproductive reform of requiring the NSA to secure judicial orders from the secret FISA court before permitting the query of the NSA's database. And permit me the brief indulgence. There are law students in the room, yes? Are there any law students in the room? Raise your hand if you go to school here. Okay, some. All right, so I want to give you just a quick, 3-minute intro to legal realism because it will matter for you. You will hear a lot of contrived formalisms to distinguish things in the law that are otherwise alike. And, for instance, you can see this demonstrated in essentially different rules applied to like situations. Law is described as the application of consistent principles across differing facts, right? But when the facts change and the rules change, you should smell that something is up. And so here's an example. When we talk, for instance, about free speech, right? People will often talk in the contemporary context about the Citizens United case regarding free speech for corporations, and they might talk about the rights that corporations have that people also have. Don't forget that corporations have more rights than you do. And I want to demonstrate in a different context this particular double standard in the rule of law. Naji spoke in his introduction about the United States claiming to be an exemplar of human rights around the world, and I'm going to broaden the context beyond surveillance and then link that back to these distinctions among seemingly similar situations. It's this administration that has asserted the right to kill people without trial through robotic remote assassination. And there's a lot of debate about the intelligence of that as a national security matter in any of the particular theaters where we deploy drones. Think about drones as the evolution of a new kind of warfare like chemical weapons and nuclear weapons that is itself a human rights abuse. Right? And think about the role our nation has had in normalizing that. And think about what grounds we might have to try to stop China from using drones in Tibet. Would we have any conceivable ground to resist that? And just to note what we're talking about with drones, we are talking about secret decisions made within an executive branch enabling the assassination of U.S. citizens without trial. What could be more antithetical to the Constitution on which our nation was founded than that? The usurpation of the powers of the judge, jury, and executioner to the executive branch, right? We also have well-established authorities for military detention without trial, not just at Guantanamo Bay, but since December 31st, 2011, here within the United States. Look up the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012 in sections 1021E, C through E. There is a statute on the books. To President Obama's credit, he has pledged not to use them in a signing statement he issued when signing this law. It gives the military to detain any of you indefinitely without trial. It's a standing order that could be used for essentially the same kind of roundups to which 100,000 Japanese Americans were subjected in World War II. That Supreme Court case upholding the detention is, of course, still what we in law would call good law, in the sense that it remains standing. And so, again, when people think about the potential politicization of tools like the NSA, think about how bad it can get. I'm not done yet. It actually gets worse than that. Torture was committed by our country, right, as an instrument of enhanced interrogation. It continues at Guantanamo Bay, particularly through the forced feeding regime. It continues pervasively across the country in U.S. prisons through the manifestation of prolonged solitary isolation. You've heard about it here before, earlier in this panel. Solitary isolation is categorically a human rights abuse. It is an instrument to deny people of their sanity. It breaks people's humanity. And it is endorsed widely by our country, at the same time that we claim to be a leader of the free world. In the face of documented torture, and I want to, so many directions in which to go, I'll just confine this to two and then try to connect this back. The Senate Intelligence Committee today has a 6,000-page report about torture committed under the Bush administration, vastly beyond the abuses we heard about at Abu Ghraib and Bagram Air Force Base. It documents, reportedly, abuses as severe as outright rape of detainees. There are videos, there are photos. They were ordered disclosed by multiple federal judges in 2009 before Congress, at the same time that it was fighting tooth and nail to stop health care reform from proceeding, united across parties in October 2009 to amend the Freedom of Information Act specifically with one reason: to give the Defense Department the authority to hide evidence of its criminal trail that multiple courts had ordered released over the Obama administration's objections. So this report, the Senate Intelligence Committee's report, is 6,000 pages long. It's classified. No one's ever seen it. You know, when Zero Dark 30 comes into the theaters and people start wondering, does torture work? The Senate Intel Committee knows it doesn't work. The Senate Intel Committee knows how bad torture was. None of us do, because it's all still secret. There is a vote in the Senate Intel Committee this spring about whether to declassify the report. I'd invite you to check it out and raise your voices about it. The last thing I want to say about torture before I connect this quickly back is that many people complicit in torture continue to serve in very prestigious government positions. There is a judge on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, one layer down from the Supreme Court, who has a lifetime, $250,000 taxpayer-funded salary. He cannot travel abroad for fear of being detained, rightfully so, as a war criminal. His name's Judge Jay Bybee, and he was the head of the Office of Legal Counsel in the Justice Department under the Bush administration. There are others who, for instance, teach law at public universities around the country. It is a travesty in plain sight. And against that, here's coming back to legal realism and the contrast among different rules. There are 2.5 million Americans in prison today for offenses that should not be criminal in the first place in a large number of their instances, while people guilty of our species' most fundamental commitments continue to draw taxpayer-funded paychecks to decide how the law applies to the rest of us. And I would just ask you, as we finish our panel, whether or not the corruption word fits. I'm running out of time, but I want to just note that I do have a range of action opportunities available to each of you, organizationally, individually. If you are at all motivated by this panel to do something about it, please come talk to me, because I'm looking for you. I look forward to your questions and comments.
Okay, again, we want to thank everyone for coming out. We're about to get into the Q&A. Before we do that, I do want to acknowledge again the co-sponsoring organizations who helped make this evening possible. That include the Coalition on Political Assassinations in the Museum of Hidden History, along with the student chapter here of the National Lawyers Guild, the chapter here of the Black Law Students Association and the Black Men's Law Society, also the Bill of Rights Defense Committee, of which Shahid is the executive director, and the Institute for Policy Studies, who is also represented in the room. And they are having a program that may be of interest to many of you next Thursday, February 27th from 6:30 to 8 p.m. at their conference room at the 1112 16th Street office. It's featuring Ajamu Baraka, formerly of the U.S. Human Rights Network. It's a dialogue in which he will discuss questions such as the range of the still developing human rights idea, the transformative politics and reconceptualizing that is needed to decolonize human rights, and the role of bottom-up reconstruction and a people-centered framework in the restructuring of a prevailing social relationships that perpetuate oppression. The director of events is here, Netfa Freeman. Raise your hand if you want to talk to him about the program. Quickly, if there was any lingering thoughts among any of the panelists, sometimes you speak, make remarks, and then you feel, oh, I forgot to say this. So I do want to offer each of you 30 seconds to a minute if there was anything that slipped your mind that came back. John?
I just want to say that at the end of my talk, you might have seen a flash of a slide that said CIA and the media. just one example of how all this information we're talking about that you haven't heard before, why you haven't heard it before. The CIA in the media was an article written by Carl Bernstein, the Watergate muckraker, who gained fame for Watergate, but then couldn't publish his article about what the Senate Church Committee found. They found that well over 400 members of the media were living dual lives in their work for the CIA. And we're not just talking about like simple journalists in the media. We're talking about the heads of all the major media, ABC, NBC, CBS. It's listed in the Senate Intelligence Committee. It's listed in Bernstein's article, CIA in the media. And so that's part of the way that they control our information. You know.
Anybody else? Okay. We had a few questions come up. One was a request. It says, is it possible to take 30 seconds in recognition of today as the 49th year of Malcolm's assassination/murder? Thanks for your consideration. I think we've taken 2 hours in recognition. If I don't, was the request for a moment of silence? I don't know, nobody's raising a hand, but but we appreciate that. And there's a question here directed to Jared or anyone else. Malcolm, in a January 1965 speech, which played on Part 2 of the Pacifica Archives on WPFW last week, that's 89.3 FM, okay, there's another question, we'll get that, Malcolm said, work with whites would definitely be possible, provided their politics was not such that they rejected armed struggle. He thought or said he thought there would be plenty of opportunities. He didn't specify under what conditions such alliances could develop short of a revolutionary crisis or conflagration engulfing all of humanity. Simultaneously, how do Pan-Africanists see that kind of development today? And there was also another question that had to do with Pan-Africanism. How can Pan-Africanism be relevant today if blacks in America feel disconnected from Africa? Towards the first comment, I would offer also, I read a speech that Malcolm gave, or interview that he gave in February 1965, where he was talking about the necessity for, black-white alliances and, Americans being able to work together towards and on social justice issues. But if anyone else...
Well, no, go ahead. Well, first, I think it's important to point out the contradiction between Pacifica Radio using Malcolm to raise funds while simultaneously cutting off all the voices that currently represent Malcolm X from their airwaves all around the nation. There's so much more to say about that. One thing I think, if I understood the question properly, one of the things I think that has to be remembered is that up until the end of his life, maybe even in that exact interview you're talking about, Malcolm X maintained that the standard for white involvement in this black revolutionary struggle was John Brown. So this was not some, again, something repackaged for today as some sort of post-racial sort of let's all hold hands and civil rights integrationist type of thing. It was that if white people were going to actually eschew the liberalism that was holding them back and join the militant wing of this international struggle, that was the kind of unity that I think he was pretty clear in saying was the standard. So, and that's, and in terms of the Pan-Africanism, I think just as a goal, it's important to, one of the reasons why Pan-Africanism may have been weakened or may be more weak today than in Malcolm's time is precisely because of all that we've been talking about here tonight. The great effort, the great lengths to which those in power have done to disconnect successive generations from those kinds of ideas and concepts. But they remain essential to this day. I mean, again, I don't want to take too much time, but just look at what's going on throughout the continent of Africa and the rest of the African diaspora. Even a cursory look at that would show that what Malcolm was arguing for remains, unfortunately, still necessary. Now, did you want me to address this now, or do you want?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Oh, all right.
Let's come back to that.
Okay, that's cool.
Did you have a comment?
Yeah. I think my brother pretty much, cleared up real good. Malcolm always made a distinction between progressive whites and liberal whites, and he despised liberal whites. And the example that he gave with John Brown was to represent the progressive whites, that is, those who basically, you know, are willing to, you know, to die for what it is that they believe in. Those were the whites that Malcolm talked about as far as any type of coalitions, any type of unions, you know, between Africans and whites. I also wanted to clear up something that I heard earlier today. People forget this, and, you know, and it's one of the biggest myths surrounding Malcolm. People forget Malcolm, when Malcolm made Hodge, you know, what we've been told is, you know, he had this great revelation and, you know, he realized that whites and Africans could come together and what have you. Truth of the matter is that Malcolm made Hodge in July of 1959. And so Malcolm already knew, you know, that whites could come to Mecca and what have you. And you know, I just think at this stage of the game, we need to stop kind of like playing that game. Like he went there and all of a sudden, you know, he had this great revelation. That's not based on the historical record. He knew that. That's it.
Jared, so there was a request for a quote that Jared read earlier.
Yeah, and the quote I was reading was from Amiri Baraka, again, who just recently passed. And as I was saying, this quote, which he was saying would happen to Malcolm, I'm arguing is currently happening to him. And the quote I was asked to reread is that, as he said, there is, of course, the syndrome Lenin spoke about, V.I., not John, no disrespect to John, but you know. There is, of course, the syndrome Lenin spoke about when he said that once opponents of the bourgeoisie are dead, the rulers transform these class enemies into ciphers or agreeable sycophants of imperialism, however askew they might have seemed in life, who are now rehabilitated all the way into being represented as the very opposite ideologically of what they actually were in life, end quote. And if you just look at a lot of the recent scholarship and the discussion around Malcolm X and a lot of other people for that matter, even in the way, Oscar Grant or Sean Bell or others whose stories are being told, you know, after their death are talked about, the key word in all of that discussion is humanize, this need to humanize, which is what I think Baraka meant by this need to rehabilitate someone's image, to bring them back in to be used by the state as a symbol of, as he said, as a sycophant of imperialism. So that's what I think that's what I meant. And I think, again, by the way, I want to say again, I think that's happening to Baraka right now. The way he's being remembered is taking that similar pattern.
Just to chime in there, I would also say that the same thing is happening to Barack. Right. An inverse dynamic where if in the prior era's heroes are now being recast as establishment figures, the people today who stand in for supposed bastions of resistance are themselves stooges for an establishment, right? And you know, I'd say the same thing to some extent about Reverend Sharpton. There's a whole litany of people who purport to be leaders but are in fact anything but. And I think what we ultimately take away from all of this, I would say, is the onus on all of us to get involved, right? The church committee happened because a bunch of people broke into an FBI office. We're having a debate today about the NSA because somebody resigned their career and blew a whistle. These people did their part, and it is on the rest of us to do ours. And, you know, we can either go to work like nothing is going on and the system in which we live is entirely legitimate and there's nothing to see behind the curtain, and get along, go along to get along. You know, that's always an option, to keep your mouth shut and go along. Especially for those of you who are law students, you'll have career opportunities, right? And you can join the establishment and look the other way and forget any of this ever happened, or you can remember where you came from, or the shoulders on whose shoulders you stand. And I think that lends to each of us an individual responsibility to raise our voices. And just to John's point about a strategy, just to give you guys an overview of it, the challenge that we face in a polyglot society is that we don't have easy lines of political identification to unite us, right? Our skin looks different, we come from different places, we have a litany of different interests, we're from different parts of the country, right? All of these things make it challenging to organize the kinds of democracy movements that in the post-colonial world were successful in repudiating outright colonial power. So how do you mount popular resistance against a military-industrial complex in a polyglot society? That's the question. And the answer, quite simply, is to all do it together. And there's a much longer answer to that, and I'm happy again to distinguish that for people and offer action opportunities. But I just want to provide in sharp relief what I see the subsequent question as, what each of you might want to ask yourselves tomorrow when you're thinking about this panel and how to act on it.
I'm sorry, there was just one piece that was asked of me, the quote about black youth, and maybe somebody on the panel will remember the direct quote. I don't have it in front of me, but the fifth tenet of the counterintelligence program's attack on black America, you got it with you?
Yeah, it says, I have the...
Because the first one is saying about get rid of the black messiah, but the fifth one is to prevent the rise of another messiah.
This isn't the complete quote, okay, but it's the first two sentences. The final goal should be to prevent the long-range growth of militant black organizations, especially among youth. Specific tactics to prevent these groups from converting young people must be developed. And fortunately, this is all of this information. I think most of which has been discussed is available, online, Google. So it's there. So it's not for lack of information that we're in, or it's not for lack of access to information that I think holds a lot of us back. It's for lack of seeking out and then lack of acting on those things that we know. John?
I just wanted to add in about the question that you were addressing, Jared. In the research community, we call this the second assassination. Mm-hmm. After you kill the body, then you go after the reputation of the person. Either way, I mean, it could be to, as you say, humanize them, could be to dehumanize them, depending on what the politics are. But so you take a Dr. King and you freeze him on the steps in 1963, having a dream. You don't take him to the period a year before, to the day before his death, when he challenges the Vietnam War and when he talks about a nightmare. Similarly, as I think Bob Kondo was pointing out, and yourself, there's stages in Malcolm's development where they want to freeze them. And
even to delineate them as separate stages, and that's what I think that Baraka, other line that I was quoting from Baraka, was talking about. That we're not there's space in between those stages that have a lot to be, and to separate them as distinct from one another is also, I think, a mistake.
Yeah.
And my point about the humanizing was that's what they're saying. When they're saying we want to humanize Malcolm X, they're saying we want to rehabilitate his image so that we can use him for our current political purpose, which is really, as you were saying, to dehumanize.
Put his face on a T-shirt.
Yeah, that's right.
But I think it also makes it then much more difficult to understand why the person was assassinated.
Right.
Because you don't really see what the motive is. In the same way that there's still a left structuralist view and an establishment view that John F. Kennedy was merely a Cold Warrior like everyone else, and there's no turning, there's no understanding of how he became, not an open opponent, but a force against elements that were rising, and could be seen as threatening to them on terms of supporting struggles against colonialism internationally, to what he was doing in terms of the Vietnam War and pulling out, and his move toward détente and ending the arms race in the Cold War, and things that he and even on the question of African American movement, no shining hero, but within these frameworks, if you're moving away from the standard or faster than the standard wants to move, you become an enemy. So, but as long as you paint him as as the Cold Warrior and somebody who's not challenging the establishment, then there's no reason to kill him. And then within the structuralist point of view, there's no reason to study his assassination. But I think that all these assassinations, once you can understand the reality of the people and what they were doing, are explained under the same rubric.
Can I add something?
Yeah, I want to add it to you, Zach. You go first.
Yeah. One of the things that those of us who are really serious about Malcolm X, are sensitive to, is whether or not there should be some type of drive to try to get a holiday or something special when it comes to Malcolm X. And I think only people who have no understanding of Malcolm's politics would ever even consider that. Plus, I think it contributes significantly to the reshaping of Malcolm's, image, his legacy, if we allow something like that to happen. So when people have come to me, as a Malcolm scholar and say, we've been thinking about trying to, get something special for Malcolm. That's not what Malcolm was about. And I tell them, no way in hell would I consider something like that, because that would demean what Malcolm X was all about. And I think that's one of the tragedies of Martin Luther King right now. Those of you who've been keeping up, that his family's going through a whole lot of stuff about patents and copyrights, and, basically it seems like they want to get paid for, whenever somebody wants to use King's image and all that type of stuff. For a serious leader, those type of issues should never be an issue. And I just think that it's despicable that this is what we've done with King at this stage of the game. Not to mention this King Day sales.
Right. That's right.
It's absurd. So my point is that we have to be especially vigilant to make sure that this type of silliness, does not happen to somebody like Malcolm X, if we understand what Malcolm X was all about. So,
Amen.
Yeah. Thanks. I just want to also add that there's a commonality between all the top assassinations of the 1960s, and that is that John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy and Malcolm X and Martin Luther King all opposed the Vietnam War. Now, it's interesting that William Pepper pointed out that Martin Luther King was assassinated on the exact year anniversary of the day he officially announced his opposition to the Vietnam War. And I think he pointed out the significance of that, and I think it underscores how much significance there is to the fact that Vietnam War was the center of the golden triangle of opium, and Afghanistan is the golden crescent of opium. And one of the resources we don't talk about, we talk about oil, but what was in both areas was tons of opium. And we know what's happened in the golden crescent of opium now. It's become enlarged in a huge way. But that's not looked at as much as, what Malcolm X was about, and he should be, that he was a serious anti-Vietnam War, opponent, as a Vietnam War opponent. Okay.
I think the first anti-war demonstration in Harlem, Malcolm was involved in organizing.
And I'd just like to add to Zach's points about Malcolm's character and being so humble. I was very struck when I visited his gravesite in upstate New York. It's not some big shrine or statue. It's just a simple grave marker, laying there. And I thought that was very emblematic of what he stood for. He came, did what he did, and now he's gone. Now it's up to us to continue the legacy of our El-Hajj Malik Shabazz. We have one final question, running a little short on time, so I want to ask our panelists to make it brief. Given what we see in Venezuela and other countries targeted by imperialism, do you see parallels between the CIA, FBI strategies between them? How do the individuals and how they do whole nations kill the body, then kill the legacy?
Definitely. Yeah. Just for an example, I think you should always look at what's being done overseas and look at home for the same tactics, and you'll find them. And if you look at the tactics at home and what they do, and if you study them closely, you'll find them being done overseas also. For example, with the incident I talked about with Tupac Shakur in Marin City, this FBI agent, Richard Held, was a rising star. His father was assistant director of the FBI. And he became an expert, and Judy Barry kind of analyzed this before her early death. But after a bomb was planted in Judy Barry's car, she was paraplegic, and she spent her time researching Richard Held and found what an expert he was at different forms of manipulation, such as mob manipulation. And so when you see these things happening in Caracas, and you see these colored revolutions that you find U.S. imperialist funding for, you find that there's incredible mob manipulation going on, and besides tons of money coming from the U.S. and Western powers. But they've become experts at mob manipulation. In Marin City, they got friends of Tupac, former friends of Tupac, to attack him with stones, because they used this technique of getting everyone thinking that he killed some girl with a gunshot that he didn't even fire. But they manipulate a mob to attack him. But it's just, if you look at a number of different examples of targeting, you'll find the similar tactics used internationally as nationally.
And I would also call people's attention to several other assassination plots that have been carried out globally, by U.S. intelligence, going back to Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, to Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, Maurice Bishop in Grenada, and on and on. This is a global problem, but today we've just taken some time to focus on specific local problems.
I think there's a legitimate question to ask about the number of Central Latin American leaders that are coming down with cancer. Cancer was studied as a weapon by the Nazis. Kurt Blom studied viral cancers for Hitler as chemical biological weapon, and he was brought to Fort Detrick in 1956 and worked for the U.S. chemical biological warfare establishment. And a number of both witnesses and other people died of fast-acting cancers. And in terms of the continent of Africa, if you go back to the beginnings of CIA planning and Bissell and others, in the Eisenhower era, the entire theme was a theme of destabilization of the continent. And I think that that's generally their theme in terms of these foreign regimes that don't go along with their penetrations for capital and for expansion of markets and resource control, that they will destabilize them. And I think it's also worth taking a look at the book Shock Doctrine, and this idea that the way you change things is to create a crisis and then come in. Even the assassination of John F. Kennedy, by my study, appears to be an implementation of a plan that he refused to implement, called Operation Northwoods, where a traumatic incident that could be plausibly blamed on Fidel Castro would be used to get the American public to go along with an invasion of Cuba and an overthrow of Fidel. And I have evidence that they were planning to do that on November 22nd, 1963. And they had also framed several weeks before with a fake Lee Harvey Oswald connecting Castro at the Mexican embassy in order to link Castro to the assassination. But I think Oswald foiled the plan by stopping him from killing him in the Texas theater, and then they had a talking head and they had to back off. But I think they do create crises in order to implement the deeper level of control that they want.
And even on the issue of cancer, I'm reminded, as we mentioned that point about a black messiah with the COINTELPRO's goals, there was Malcolm, who was mentioned, who had already been assassinated at the time. There was Martin Luther King, who we've discussed, Elijah Muhammad, who was old, but finally Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, who, when he passed, he was convinced that the cancer that he died from was not of natural origin. Jared, you?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to everybody for being here and for those who organized this for putting this together. But I think that this last question speaks to the importance of Malcolm X's Pan-Africanism and internationalist outlook. That none of what is addressing us as a problem today is happening to us in a vacuum. It's happening as an international problem. I think this is clearly, as Baba Zak and others have proven over the years, what made Malcolm such a threat to the state. And a threat to even, as Dr. King would become later, to establish civil rights leadership, this desire to internationalize the struggle. This became a problem for the state itself, obviously, and its imperialist agenda, but also the more conformist and establishment so-called oppositional leadership in this country. And with all due respect, Naomi Klein, I think more important than the shock doctrine is just to go back and look at Malcolm's predecessors intellectually, or some of his contemporaries even. Frantz Fanon described what would later be called a shock doctrine, far before Naomi got to it. And his work should be definitely brought back into people's consciousness if it isn't already. Ami Césaire, that whole crew of anti-colonial scholars, Lumumba too. If you read their work and read their speeches, they were all talking about what Klein would later call a shock doctrine, taking advantage of people's destabilized moments to further your agenda. So I don't want to leave them out and those people struggling as well. But yeah,
I think we've reached a conclusion. We'll allow Can you take about 30 seconds and
Yeah.
60 seconds?
One of the things that I want to say real quickly is that people don't realize this. The United States practice of assassination predates the CIA. The CIA was founded with the National Security Act in 1947. The first official American assassination took place in July of 1943 when the United States War Department killed Yamamoto when they intercepted information. Yamamoto, by the way, was a rear admiral who planned and basically organized Pearl Harbor. So they intercepted information saying that he was going toward the Solomon Islands, and they sent like 18 fighter planes to basically kill him. He was the first official. After that, in the 1950s, the United States was involved in several assassinations. President Ramos, they tried to kill NASA. The Church Committee only investigated about 5 assassinations. There were probably double, possibly triple that. They just chose not to go there. The few that they went after was Lumumba, Castro attempts. They went after President Cecilia in the Dominican Republic. They went after Snyder in Chile.
Chile.
And Allende. Yeah, well, actually, Snyder was, they had to kill Snyder in order to kill Allende. Snyder was his strong-arm man and stuff like that. But my point is that the Church Committee was a smokescreen. And, the government had to do something, and so they did as little as they possibly could. Even though, one last thing I will say, though, surprisingly, the Church Committee did find that Dwight D. Eisenhower authorized the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. So at least they didn't cover up, as significant, as despicable as that is, at least they didn't cover that up. They did find that.
Well, I just want to say thank you for coming and hope you learned something tonight from the panel. And I think that, unfortunately, much of our history is hidden, and we need to unearth it and take it back and own it and act on it.